Human beings have been wanting to know where they came from for centuries, how everything around them was created, and how to expand their borders into the unknown. Despite this, space continues to be a hostile and unknown environment. It's perhaps the last unconquered territory we need to delve into. But, dear viewer, in the last century, or more specifically in the last 5 or 6 decades, space has gradually become an increasingly familiar, and it has to be said, a more accessible place. And the fundamental question is, well, why? Human beings took the great leap into space in the late 1950s when the United States and the Soviet Union began a long and pretty rough space race in a bid to get one up on their adversary. This is a story we all know quite well. What we probably don't know so well is the extent to which this competition between the two great superpowers contributed to scientific and technological development in general. Basically, these two great powers had to invest so much money and so many resources in the space race that, in addition to the, let's say, moral superiority of being the first to conquer space, it brought great scientific, technological, and military advances. Yes, military. Don't think for a second that the space race was merely an exercise in scientific enlightenment. Not at all. The fact is that with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the communist bloc, things began to change. The former Soviet countries ran out of money, and the United States gradually began to devote less and less of their budget to space. In fact, the percentage of federal spending dedicated to the space race has dropped by more than 50% since 1991. So there was no real competition. Governments, especially the US, as we've just seen, began to lose interest in space. The race for dominance, well, it came crashing back to Earth. And that paved the way for private companies to become more and more involved. Right now, more than a dozen private companies are developing rockets to launch objects into space. Satellites, supplies for the International Space Station, and even passengers. You've probably heard of SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and others. And this brings up some questions. Is a huge new market in space exploration in the process of being created? Could the future of humans in space really develop through the private sector? If so, what will happen to the government agencies? Will they be able to coexist with private companies?
Change of players.
As you all know, during the 20th century, space conquests basically involved two main players. The United States and the Soviet Union tackled the challenge by investing vast amounts of money. To give you an idea, on just the Apollo program alone, the United States spent more than $110 billion in today's money. That's $110 billion on a program that employed more than 400,000 people. At that time, the aerospace sector was so important that the US government soon took over almost absolute control of all space projects. In 1967, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom agreed on the Outer Space Treaty, a treaty that, among other things, established the responsibility of governments over every activity undertaken by non-governmental aerospace entities. That is, that every company or any other private aerospace entity was subordinate to their country's government. In practice, this meant that any private business project had to be explicitly approved by the company's nation of origin. And not only that, as the state was ultimately responsible for the company's actions, in the end, the direction of every project was in the hands of politicians and officials. Ultimately, it was the government who approved the day-to-day operations of the aerospace companies. What's more, this treaty is still in force today. However, due to the fact that the space race has lost steam in international affairs, the application of the treaty is just less strict. Thanks to this, the private aerospace sector has gained more and more freedom. And this is hugely significant. You see, for some years, the space race has been warming up again and is enjoying a bit of a golden era. And this is happening due to one fundamental reason: the reduction of entry barriers. This is something we've all experienced on a smaller scale. In recent decades, technology has become cheaper, and the capabilities of our devices have taken an exponential leap. All this has led us to think about the aerospace area as much more accessible. Think about it for a moment. A supercomputer from the 90s, which could only be accessed by governments and huge multinationals after paying millions for the privilege, only had the computing power of an iPhone 6. And this explains why more and more countries now have their own space programs and space agencies. And we're not just talking about superpowers like China, who are joining the new space race by storming through the front door, but also much less powerful countries like Ghana. Yep, that's right, even Ghana has a space agency. But the real shake-up in this new race is that it's not governments pulling the strings anymore, but rather private companies. And this is a paradigm shift. Now that we have more governments and more especially new companies involved, the question is, are we on the verge of seeing an even more exciting space race?
Israeli company sends world's first privately funded mission to moon. Chandrayaan-2. Success in India's second attempt at launching moon mission.
To give you an idea, new aerospace companies such as SpaceX can offer launches to Earth's orbit for around $60 million. And that may sound like a lot, but if you compare it with the almost $500 million that it costs to launch the space shuttle, it sounds like a bit of a bargain. And it's precisely this efficiency in the costs and resources of the private aerospace industry which has led governments to give up on doing the work themselves and become customers instead. Governments are now customers of private aerospace companies that work autonomously. Obviously, private agencies such as NASA have had private suppliers since day one, just as the Army or the Air Force do. That's pretty clear, but let's not skip over this detail. It's one thing to manufacture something under a government space agency's commission, and it's a completely different thing to develop an entire independent launch program. Put it another way, it's like the difference between a company that builds a road or a hospital for a government and another company that builds its own road or its own private hospital. In the first case, the government makes all the decisions, while in the second, it's the company itself that takes the initiative, makes the decisions, and decides what to spend on, how the budget will be allocated, how much, and when to spend it. Well, that's exactly what's happening with the space race. So are we moving towards a kind of space privatization?
A well-divided pie.
For the US, it's no longer useful to monopolize each and every one of the fields of the aerospace sector. Not only does it not make sense, it's also counterproductive. Under the new paradigm, government agencies will focus their resources on basic scientific research, such as the investigation of the lunar surface, asteroids, stars, or the most distant planets. Meanwhile, private companies will deal with applied research, or in other words, in offering concrete products such as launching services with reusable rockets, satellite manufacturing, and to a lesser extent, the much-hyped space tourism. This coexistence, and not only coexistence, but rather collaboration between public agencies and companies, could bring us the best years of space exploration yet. But now a key question: why have private companies managed to perform so much better than typical government space agencies in terms of cost efficiency and innovation? Well, surely many of you already know the answer to this, and that's market incentives. In other words, making things that work at a reasonable price to make money. Money that, by the way, usually comes, surprise, surprise, from the government agencies themselves. Between 2000 and 2018, various public agencies in the United States, such as NASA and the Air Force, have invested $7.2 billion in 67 aerospace companies. Of all this money, 93% went to companies dedicated to rocket launches, companies like SpaceX. Therefore, every dollar invested by public agencies achieves greater results. So even though the NASA budget, for example, has decreased, their spending efficiency has increased significantly.
Elon Musk says the new SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket crushes its competition on cost.
That's why NASA has been investing money in companies like SpaceX practically since they were founded. During the first decade of operations, SpaceX spent $1 billion. Approximately half of that money came from government contracts with NASA. In other words, NASA financed a large part of SpaceX's growth. And the truth is that this strategy has worked for both sides. The development of SpaceX has led to unprecedented and substantial cost savings for NASA. Just since 1981, the cost per kilo sent into Earth's lower orbit has plummeted from more than $85,000 with the Space Shuttle to less than $2,000 with SpaceX's Falcon 9. This is an almost 98% cost reduction. And that's just the beginning. Because soon other rockets, such as the Falcon Heavy, promise to plunge the cost per kilogram launched into space to figures below the $1,000 mark. Now, surely many of you might be wondering now, well, hang on, Simon, what about Europe? You're only talking about the United States here. What's Europe doing? Well, Europe has Arianespace, the European aerospace company that handles most of ESA's launches, the European Space Agency. However, there are some differences.
And Europe, from pioneer to lost in space.
If I told you that not too long ago, Arianespace Europe was the world leader in commercial rocket launches, what would you say? And I use the past tense here because, as you can see from this graph, as of 2013, and because of the success of SpaceX, Europe has lost its dominant position for the number of commercial space launches in favor of the United States. Now, what makes a company like Arianespace, which takes almost 20% of ESA's more than $6 billion annual budget, unable to compete against newly created companies such as SpaceX? And why did the United States leave Europe behind in this industry? As you can see, Arianespace was created in 1980 to compete with the US's outdated and expensive space shuttle. In the 1990s, its Ariane 5 rocket managed to reduce launch costs to $175 million in comparison with the more than $450 million that the space shuttle's launch costs. But in addition to its impressive cost for the time, the Ariane 5 also became the world's most reliable rocket. It only had 2 absolute failures in more than 100 launches. So everything seemed to indicate that Europe was set to be in a leading position over the following decades, and in fact, it was for several years until 2013. The tide quickly turned when suddenly that $175 million price tag, which was the cost of launching the Ariane 5, became way too much in comparison with the scant $60 million of SpaceX's Falcon 9. And that's precisely where the European aerospace industry's problem lies. They haven't been able to, or haven't wanted to, reinvent themselves.
Do you buy a Mercedes because it's cheap? Stefano Bianchi, director of ESA's Launcher Development Department.
It doesn't sound like the best strategy for competing in a market where new American startups are sweeping in with low prices, does it? In any case, they are now trying to follow in the footsteps of new North American competition with the development of the Ariane 6, which promises a launch cost of about $95 million and which could be put into operation as early as 2021. That's the result of competition. More and more agencies, companies, and professionals are competing to gain a foothold in the aerospace sector. And if experience has taught us anything, it's that competition drives new achievements. In short, that's how things are in a sector that is increasingly becoming dominated by private companies to the detriment of governments. Now, the question is, will these companies like SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, or Blue Origin be able to take the space race to a whole new level? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting us in our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.